First of all, thank you, Michael, for spending this hour with us.
Oh, you're welcome. And I always enjoy conversations with you. You're one of my favorite writers and thinkers.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think that you're probably known to just about everyone as the founder of the Skeptic Society and probably the best known skeptic in the world, including your column in Scientific um, American. And we had a long podcast on my novel, Atlas Shrugged, which is great, and we'll make that available. But the reason that I brought you back is to talk about individualism writ large. We'll see how much my novel comes back into it, but really what I want to think about is which way individualism, what is individualism, when does it go right, when does it go wrong, and is there something that actually deserves to be called not individualism, which we can, something that's beyond individualism. So let's begin by asking you, Michael, what is individualism?
Well, I ground moral theory in the rights of the individual. So I think, going back to the founding of the United States, that, only the individual can make choices for him or herself. And, in terms of like the right to vote or, the right to have your own life, bodily autonomy, that all applies to individuals. Only individual minds can think. There aren't hive minds, essentially. We're social creatures. Of course, we can be influenced by group beliefs and ideologies, but we still are responsible for our own actions and our own choices. So the individual, I think you have to draw the line somewhere. Of course, we're made out of, these trillions of other organisms in our gut and so forth that aren't really us. But collectively speaking, you have to draw the line somewhere. So I put it around my skin and my skull. This is my body. This is my mind. I'm responsible for myself. And society should therefore hold me accountable for actions that I do. So in the moral arc, for example, I argue that, races don't vote, individuals vote. Genders don't vote, individual men and women or trans or whatever vote. It's the individual that must be protected. And protected from what? It's protected from the collective, any kind of collective, a religion, a political party, a state, a nation, whatever that imposes violence or the threat of violence or coercion on individuals that we must be, protected from. So you need a state to do that, and so forth. And so to that extent, to bring up a current example and concern of mine is, the whole civil rights movement was based on the idea that you as an individual should be treated as such, not as a member of a group. And therefore, I should not judge you by the color of your skin or by what bits you have between your legs or who you prefer to sleep with or whatever collective entity, that you should be judged by your own character, not the color of your skin, and so on, to echo Dr. King. And we seem to have gone in the reverse of that. That is to say, with critical race theory, for example, it seems like the most important thing I can know about you is the color of your skin or your gender or whatever. And I think that's a monstrous reversal of, what the civil rights movement was about.
Okay, there are some provocative statements, and I'd want to push back against some of them. For example, high minds. But my contribution to this, I want to actually quote a passage from Tocqueville's Democracy in America, chapter 8, which is titled How the Americans Combat Individualism by the Principle of Self-Interest Rightly Understood. And Tocqueville, always worth reading, said this: the Americans, on the other hand, are fond of explaining almost all of the actions of their lives by the principle of self-interest rightly understood. They show with complacency how an enlightened regard for themselves constantly prompts them to assist one another and inclines them willingly to sacrifice a portion of their time and property to the welfare of the state. In this respect, I think they frequently fail to do themselves justice. For in the United States, as well as elsewhere, people are sometimes seen to give way to those disinterested and spontaneous impulses that are natural to man. But the Americans seldom admit that they yield to emotions of this kind. They are more anxious to do honor to their philosophy than to themselves. And the way I render that is that in America, especially at that time, individualism, rightly understood, became a kind of a narrative that aligned what individuals do to the state in a benign sense. And so it's like for individualism to be benign, for it to lead to a good society, there has to be a vision of society. And then individuals work towards that, perceiving it to be in their self-interest to do so. And so for me, when individualism goes right, then it does have that societal pole, basically. We do have to imagine something larger than ourselves, call it a collective. And then we have to see that it's in our self-interest to work towards it. But if we don't have that social pole, then I would claim that individualism goes wrong. What do you think about that, Michael?
Yeah, I would say the way I think about that is, yes, we are members of a society. Well, first of all, we're members of a family, and then an extended family, and then a local community, and then a larger community, and then a society, and then a nation, and then a globe. So the expanding moral sphere, or expanding circle, as Peter Singer described it, certainly applies, and we can think of these concentric rings about from me, the individual, out from there, extending all the way to the entire species, let's say. And one of the things I tracked in the moral arc was how that sphere has been expanding to include more and more people, and why that is. We could get into that later or whatever. But to address your point, yes, of course, all of our individual choices and decisions are made in the context of some collective, some group that we belong to. But, Adam Smith's argument in The Wealth of Nations was that it's not from the benevolence, or he might have said sympathy, of the butcher and the baker that I get my stuff from them. It's that I appeal to their own self-interest. They need to make money based on what they just made, and I need their product. And so we have a mutual exchange, and they win and I win, and that's a win-win scenario. Now, unlike most people think that Smith was this, sort of unfettered free market capitalist guy, he wasn't. He was very aware that whenever individuals collect into a group of, say, businessmen or industrialists, a cabal is afoot where they plan to, fix prices or manipulate the public or whatever. So we definitely need rules from the top down. We need some kind of structure. We need a government to steer the economy, so to speak, with those rules in the same way that athletes need rules. So if I can use that analogy, athletes want to do whatever they can to win, and it's the onus is on the governing body, the referees, the rule makers, the people that enforce the rules, that impose the punishments. It's on them to make sure that the game is fair, because the athletes are going to do what we know what they're going to do. They're going to do whatever they can to win. So as an analogy, we might say, of course, people in business want to make as much money as they possibly can. That's the whole point of being in business. And so it's our duty as a society to structure some kind of set of rules that allows people as much freedom as possible, but that the whole thing doesn't go off the rails because of the kind of built-in part of our nature of wanting as much as we can possibly get.
Yeah, and for those that want to ask questions, if I could ask you to type in just a little bit into chat so I can put you in a queue. You don't have to type the full question, but I can now, when we turn to the Q&A, I'll know who to drop on first. So you can queue up in the chat. And I wanted to affirm, Michael, something you said, that first and foremost, we should be thinking of ourselves as human beings and citizens of the earth. And then we might have secondary identities. Actually, it's not just that we might have, we do, always will. And that there must be, in order for this all to work out to the global good, not only must there be some strong sense of individuality, there's the individualism, but there must be multiple layers of intermediate units, therefore intermediate identities, so that although you're an individual, you're also a member of your family, your church, your neighborhood, your workplace, your county, your nation, et cetera, those intermediate layers are necessary. And that's why I think that when you really get multi-level like that, you might end up asking the question, why are we calling this individualism? why aren't we calling it multilevelism or something like that? And as a biologist, I think this is especially, actually amazingly appropriate, that what we know biologically is that an individual organism is a very highly cooperative group of lower level entities, that individuals, everything we call an individual, in fact evolved not by small mutational steps from other individuals, but as societies of lower level units that became so cooperative that they then qualified as a higher level organism. And so the concept of society as an organism and organism of society have truly merged. And it's in that sense, Michael, that I think the concept of a group mind, and we know it's not science fiction for like the social insects, and it's not science fiction for us either. So I don't think you can categorically state that that there's no such thing as a hive mind. The concept of an organism is not bounded by a membrane. We already know that from the social insects. So that's my provocation to you. And then I'm amazed that nobody's put anything in the chat yet. How can that be? Am I wrong about that? What is the matter with you folks? I know.
Well, okay. First of all, David, we're not a social insect. We're very different from the social insects, both genetically and in complexity. So, I think that analogy only takes us so far. But in any case, the idea that there's a hive mind, what worries me about that is it's too easy to slip from there to this kind of collective blood and soil philosophy and ideology that led to so much disaster in the first half of the 20th century, either on the left with the communists' revolutions and wars and genocides, or on the right with the fascist and Nazi ideologies that led to genocide, and those were done in the name of the collective whole. That this is like the trolley problem. Would you flip a switch to divert a trolley down one track to avert killing 5 workers and kill just the 1 worker? You're familiar with this, and almost everybody says, yeah, I would flip the switch. That seems the right thing to do. Kind of a utilitarian argument. Sacrifice the 1 to save the 5. But the problem with that, if you scale that up to a larger society, it's easy to then argue, well, we should sacrifice the 6 million Jews in order to save the 60 million Germans, the pure Aryan race, because we are the good hive and they're the bad hive. And that kind of collectivist thinking, that hive thinking, is very dangerous. This is what leads to genocide in a kind of calculated utilitarian way, which is why we still need rights arguments, that is, rights theories. And something like a Bill of Rights that says it doesn't matter what the collective wants. It doesn't matter what the democratic majority want. There's certain things we're not going to let the majority decide. And, that's what the Bill of Rights is for. And, that's what I think it was Jefferson, or maybe it was Madison, that called the tyranny of the majority. We have to be protected from that. So that kind of collective thinking really worries me.
Yeah, well, I think that it's an occasion for pointing out that in multi-level selection theory, within group cooperation and between group competition are joined at the hip. And so it has been true throughout history and throughout the animal world that members of groups cooperate to compete with other groups. And in human history, that has always been the case, although those cooperative units keep getting larger and larger and larger. So it's against that background that if you look at some of these belligerent states, they're succeeding too well as superorganisms, basically. And so what do but again, when we think of other states, including our own, in terms of our own track record of what we do on behalf of our nation first, basically, it's not as if we're totally innocent of disruptive between group competition. So what we really need to do is to extend cooperation up the scale to global cooperation. We can agree upon that. Well, I've got some questions here, so let's just we're not ending our conversation. We're just bringing in others. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to unmute. So, Philip, if you want to, if you could just type yourself, get yourself on the queue, Philip, and then we'll begin with Ed, who's first in the queue here.
My question, just reacting to one of Michael's points, I take your point 100% that we need to worry about the collective, but you mentioned, that society wants to put regulations in place in order to help individuals, but these regulations aren't just aimed at an individual; they're aimed at improving the welfare of a collective. There's a push and pull between this individualism and collectivism. You can't just throw away the collective and only focus on individuals. And I think that's David's main point with multi-level selection, is that there's push and pull between all of them. So do you not see that there's that need to look at collectives bigger and bigger as you go out as well, when you put together these regulations that you just called for?
Yeah. Certainly. Here I would introduce Alan Fiske's, the anthropologist Alan Fiske's relational models theory. He has 4 relational models of how individuals within collectives interact with each other, exchange with each other, and so on. So the 4 are communal sharing, which is like freely sharing resources within a group. There's no tab keeping. It's very egalitarian, this kind of one flesh, common essence. And this is like married couples or relatives, families, friends that are sharing apartments, something like that. And then his second one is authority ranking, where you have this kind of linear hierarchy, dominant status, age, size, strength, wealth, precedence, and so on. And this is like a boss and an employee, the teacher, student, and parent and child. And that's a different kind of relationship. And so it would have a different set of rules for exchange. Like, married couples, of course, have sex. Bosses and employees should not have sex. Teachers and students should not have sex. And parents and children, of course, should not have sex. So, there's the rules are different there. And then 3, equality matching, which is like tit-for-tat reciprocity, division of resources equitably via turn-taking, coin-flipping, matching contributions, cut and divide the cake equally, and so on. That would be like friends splitting gas, informal exchanges. Sometimes marriages are like that. It's kind of this, I'll do this for you, you do that for me. And then finally, the 4th one, market pricing, which is the economy of strangers. There's no way in a market of a bunch of strangers you can have these kinds of other rules that are informal, which is why you have currency and prices and rents and salaries, benefits, interest, credit, and so on. And so I think that's, if we tease those 4 apart, and then the violations of these norms is it makes it apparent why that we need them. Like, if I go have dinner at a restaurant and I don't have any money, and I say, well, I'll have you over for dinner in exchange, the restaurant owner's not going to be vibing that, right? Or if I have friends over for dinner at my house and they offer to pay me, that would just be too weird. Which is why things like, prostitution and organ sales feels weird, because those are normally under the kind of communal sharing that you just do for the good of it. And putting a price on it shifts it to like a market pricing category, which is, kind of counterintuitive. Anyway, that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think that if I could build upon that, so when individualism goes wrong, it's often because of too much reliance on only the market, as opposed to these other forms of social interactions. And when you really basically put too much faith in the invisible hand, at that point you're saying that individuals can just follow their own lower level interests, and then the invisible hand will make sure that that's aligned with the welfare of society. But that's not the case. That's a fantasy. And so I think laissez-faire taken too far is one way that individualism goes wrong. But that said, laissez-faire in the right context is actually essential. All the most successful nations on earth are vibrant market economies, but their markets are calibrated. The state plays a big role, labor plays a big role, and capital plays a big role, and they work collaboratively. But I think also when you said that individuals must be protected from whom, and then you said the state, the collective, I want to actually go beyond that and say that exploitation and bullying is scale independent. Take the smallest of groups, and you ask the question within that group, what do individuals need to be protected from? Well, in part, bullies within the group or other members of the group that are not basically being solid citizens. And so I think that the idea that cooperation needs to be protected, that if we're going to extend ourselves to each other, then that has to be protected. That's something which has to take place at every one of those levels. It's not just the state. That too is multi-level.
Yeah.
And I actually, I mean, if we agree on that, let's establish that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And although I would turn it around a little bit on the state, because often people turn to the state for rent, what's called rent seeking in economics, but basically special protections. So much of conservative economics that I don't like is this kind of crony capitalism, or they're kind of seeking special privileges. So tariffs are a way for American industries to ask the government for special protection from competitors overseas that they can't compete with. Well, who is harmed in that? Well, consumers, American consumer individuals are harmed by that because prices go up when you put tariffs on them. It's not like the corporations are going to absorb those tariffs and just take a lower profit. No, they just raise their prices. So, and Reagan did this when he essentially bailed out the Harley Davidson motorcycle company by putting tariffs, very high tariffs, on Honda and Yamaha motorcycles in competition. I remember when this happened because I had a Honda 175 motorcycle, and I was thinking about getting another one, and it's like the prices went way up. Why? Well, because Reagan did that. Mr. Small Government, keep your government hands off my private wealth. And Trump's, again, the problem with Trump's economic policy is that he just everything was win and lose. Well, a proper system set up should be win and win, and so his trade policies were all based on this. For us to win, those other guys over there got to lose, China especially,
Well, what we can say is that socialism leads to the concentration of power, and so does unregulated capitalism leads to in a different way, leads to a concentration of power. And as soon as you get that concentration of power, that's where the bullying and the exploitation begins. So when we think about creating this regulatory structure, using your sports team analogy, we definitely have to keep that have in mind. Let's go to Alan Ziesman. Alan, do you want to unmute and speak your question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering a couple of things, and I think they're related. It seems to me, I understand that Michael describes the world from the individual out, but everything I know about those individuals, and I think everything that psychology knows about those individuals, is they're actually not cognitively capable of even approaching the number and type of self-interested decisions that they need to make in order to position themselves vis-a-vis everybody else. And it seems to me that these, quote, decisions, unquote, are being made in some other way. And if I think about history and culture and society, they seem to be somehow, I'm not sure how to describe this. I don't know the answer to this. Passed down. And in some ways, it seems to be that an individual, there's no such thing as an individual. There's a body that is so formed by everything around them, so dependent, so ultimately interrelated, that the communities that they are from are just as important as they are, even in their own individual decisions.
Yeah, here I guess I would say that that's the role for like a choice architecture, to use a popular term, in which a government or an industry or somebody tilts the matrix in a way that it gives individuals incentives to do things that help the collective down the road. So, for example, giving married couples a tax break, which encourages marriage, or giving people the interest deduction on their taxes for their mortgage payments, This encourages home ownership. And, so, societies make decisions like that so that the selfish thing for me to do would be to own a house and then take that deduction from the mortgage, or to get married, or, get a tax break if I have kids. All right, so I'm going to have kids, or make donations to nonprofits. I get to write that off my taxes. So this encourages people to do charitable things like that. It's not that they wouldn't be charitable, because we do have a charitable, pro-social aspect to our nature, but, we're not super good at it. So we need incentives as individuals to do the right thing, as it were, which is why you have red lights and police cars park police cars on the side of the road so people will slow down, because we know people want to edge up their speed and so on. So you get that constant push and pull between the individual and their selfish motives, and that they have a good side. So you want the superstructure or superorganism, if you will, David, to tilt the incentives for me to do the right thing.
Yeah, Alan, I really resonate to what you said here. And so and there's quite a bit I can provide by way of like other people and references and so on. I'm just going to reel off a few. If you read the work of Joseph Henrich, and especially his student, Michael Muthakrishna, who just gave an online talk yesterday on this topic, you'll find, Alan, something very simpatico with what you were saying. I think it's very reminiscent of Buddhist thought. When Buddhism encourages you to basically abandon the sense of self and take a more systemic view, I think that's very reminiscent of that. And I have a new article with Jim Cohen titled "Groups as Organisms: Implications for Therapy and Training." And Jim has founded something called social baseline theory. You can type in social baseline theory and get at some of that. And basically what that says is that since individuals never existed alone throughout our evolutionary history, we always functioned in the context of small and, for the most part, cooperative groups. The brain and body have evolved to integrate both our personal resources and our social resources without even noting the difference. Right. And so when you take an individual and you remove them from a cooperative group, you automatically put that individual in a stress zone. In a stress zone, brain and body are now in emergency mode, mobilizing individual resources to make up for the lack of social resources. So that's the degree to which the human being is actually not bounded by their skin. And the same goes when you look at cognitive processes that are typically studied at the individual level, like memory, perception, decision-making, all of these things. It's just an assumption of weird cultures that these are individual level properties. The fact is, and especially memory chief among them, Alan, I'm agreeing with you that we only remember a tiny fraction of what the culture of information which is maintained by the culture. And there has to be elaborate mechanisms for us to reach outside of ourselves to find information that are in the heads of others. And much of that is subconscious. And so I think this is the degree to which the group mind, I think, is something which is only dawning upon us. Aubrey, you are next. And I need to learn to speak less so that you guys can speak more. Aubrey, why don't you unmute and then ask your question.
Hi, Michael. Could you, by chance, just run through real quick what you had mentioned earlier about critical race theory so that I can tighten up my question real quick?
Oh, yes. Well, critical race theory, basically, the basic tenets of it is that
I understand what it is, but I wanted to just. My concern. Okay, let
me just go straight to my concern. Then is that they seem to be emphasizing the placement of individuals into these different intersecting groups. So I'm a white guy, so I'm white. I'm a guy, so I'm male. So I'm intersecting white and male, so I have double privilege. And let's say an African American woman, has the discrimination as against her from being a woman and for being African American, whereas a white woman just has just the woman part. And so they start layering on these different categories, abled versus disabled, and, cognitively impaired versus high IQ, being a member of a colonial subjected people versus a colonizing nation. And, there's dozens of these different intersecting categories. Okay, so it's one thing to say, is it true that, these discriminations have happened in the past? Yes, of course, it's true. We don't live in that world anymore. There's still some issues, but, we've made a lot of progress in the last 50 years. But what was for the civil rights movement for? That's, it was very successful, and we should recognize that. But my moral concern is that what happened to the individual? I mean, just me, I just want to be treated as an individual, my ideas, my behaviors, held accountable, and so forth, not based on who I am, based on how much melanin I have in my skin. And that's exactly what critical race theory is teaching now children, that, the most important thing you can think about your other schoolmates is the color of their skin. Well, this has a very bad history of what, of teaching youngsters that we should judge people based on the color of their skin. This is not going to end well if this continues, and it will, at the very least, harm race relations.
Aubrey, what do you have to say about that?
Critical race theory is more rooted in law reform and legal institutions and the law. So I appreciate your cultural application, but it's not. It doesn't align with its roots or how.
Well, yeah, that's right. It's evolved, and all movements like that evolve. And certainly, identifying issues like redlining in real estate and loans. Yes, of course, this was a very correct error to make. This was a bias, it was a prejudice, and so on. And most of that has been alleviated legally. Now, it's going to take a few generations for, let's say, home ownership rates to equal out between whites and blacks in America, because these things take time, but we're moving in the right direction. Now, I know there's many other legal issues, and so when we talk about institutional racism, for example, as I understand it, every white person in America could be not racist anymore. We could all just be inclusive and colorblind and so on. And still that, these kind of legal constraints holding back people of color could still be embedded in the legal system, and those legal changes need to be made. Okay, let's look at them one by one. What exactly is the problem here? Is it a hiring thing for this particular industry? Just can't seem to get itself to hire 50% women in that particular job, and if not, why not? So I'm more in favor of targeting specific problems that need to be solved, rather than this blanket, we have an institutional racism problem, somebody needs to do something, because problems are almost never solved in that kind of big global way.
I agree with, yep, go ahead.
I need to give equal time. But Aubrey, go ahead, and then I'll make a quick comment and we'll proceed to Diane.
I know, I feel bad because I spent most of the time.
No, not at all. Please.
So if I could finish, so there is really truly no control group for the individual experience, is what I'm hearing. And depending on where you, where you set off this multi-selection theory and where you begin, and its jumping off point and its platform, and whether or not it recognizes institutional racism or really the world as it is, rather than how it wants to see the world, which is kind of pie in the sky and rose-colored glasses. And we all wish we could, sit around hand holding and not thinking of each other in terms of race and gender and sexuality and all of these things that historically we've hobbled and made out to be a disadvantage. I guess my approach would be to not ignore these things as they are and as they remain to be, and think about history as this unfolding of events, and where you follow this history all the way to present day and follow it naturally, and think about the laws and the rules and the norms and the values and all of these intangibles that an individual would think about in terms of its collective surroundings, and we would we would then, open our eyes and wake up from this utopia that you've created, through ignoring the institutional biases that we have and the implicit biases that we have. And we would wake up and we would look around and we would say, oh my gosh, the highest concentration of wealth and power in this country is a certain individual. So what do we do with that? Do we say, okay, let's chuck that out the window, and everybody just, if we can all think as, in terms of not seeing each other in terms of color or sexuality or gender or, anything disadvantaged, do we still just, like I say, from that jumping off point, just continue to contribute to, that higher concentration of all of the spoils of our hard work? Is that essentially what it costs to be a part of this multi-selection group?
If I could have the next say, and then we'll move on. There's so much more to say, but I think a lot hinges on whether these problems are like mostly in the past and we're on the mend, as opposed to continuing to be deeply, deeply systemic, I think. And also that when individuals get together in a group and that group has a given purpose, that purpose more or less provides a common identity, and then other differences between group members fades into the background. This is something that happens quite naturally, and we get the kind of thing that, Michael, you would call for, at least for the purposes of that group. Why are we together? Well, to do X. That's what unites us, and then everything else we put aside. So that's, I think, a bit of optimism at the scale of small groups. But let's proceed to Diane. I'm really eager for this point that you're making here, Diane.
Hi. Well, that was in response to a remark on chat. It's not a general topic, actually.
Well, actually, I think it's important. So what do you mean when you say deep feeling is a part of the functionality, not a contradiction of it? Could you just elaborate that very briefly, if you don't mind?
Well, if I remember correctly, there was a remark in the chat about a distinction between something that's done, I don't know, for the sake of rules or whatever, or rationally, versus deep feeling. And what I was getting at was the idea that the deep feeling is part of the actually evolutionary equipment that motivates people to do things that are cooperative.
Let me elaborate on it if I understand it correctly, which is that if you look at the religious impulse, what often happens is that people get together for something that is very important to all of them, and they come to regard it as sacred. And what that means is that this sacred thing dominates them. They subordinate themselves to it. They actually willingly give up their own identity. And then all of them work together. They sort of meld, and they work towards that common good. If you just think about that from a functional standpoint, you can see that groups that are organized like that are likely to be very successful groups. You've eliminated the distance between the self-interest and the group goal. So this is very much part of our equipment. And in some ways it seems against individualism, but it's again something we do all the time. Michael, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I was just thinking of the neighborhood where I just moved to in Santa Barbara, where I live in this kind of mountain community where there's this private road that's about a mile long. And just before the year before I moved up there, they repaved this road. And so, of course, collectively, everybody chipped in because it's a private road, so everybody had to pay for it. But apparently what they did was the further down the road you lived, the more you paid into it because you're using more of the road. And I thought that's a pretty creative way because, the guy that lives, 10 feet off into the road, he's like, I'm only using 10 feet. I don't want to pay, for a quarter of a mile. And that was one way to solve that problem. And I think what you're talking about there is collective action that each of us benefits from. So I'm happy to have an interstate system, that Eisenhower orchestrated in the 1950s because I benefited from it. So I'm happy to pay taxes to do that and so forth. So these are collective action problems that have to be solved. Fisheries are a big current problem where these the tragedy of the commons in which everybody rushes out and takes as much as they can. Okay, well we need a governing body, in this case a government government, or maybe even a superorganism government here for international waters, in order to, protect every individual fisherman is going to be better off if there's some sort of restriction on overfishing these fisheries. So that would be a good example, I think, of what we're talking about.
Oh, great. Steve Gilbert, would you like to chime in?
Okay, I'm going to say something different than the comment that I posted. So I'm really struggling to get at what the fundamental nub of the difference, if there is one, is between David and Michael. It seems to me that as a primate, I am both an individual and a member of different groups, and that's the yin and yang of human existence. And it sounds like you guys are just arguing about yin and yang, but you both agree that the other half of the circle is there too. So I could use some help from David and Michael in trying to get a better handle on what exactly is it the two of you are arguing about? Because I'm not quite sure I'm understanding it in its real core fundamental way, if that question makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And David, I'll just hand it off to you, because I think, if you tell me if I'm wrong, I think this is asking the difference between individual selection versus group selection. That is, what is natural selection targeting? And Dawkins, of course, would make the case it's the individual organism, or it's a genome. And I think you would make the argument yes, that's true, but there's more targets of selection. In this case, a group.
Well, I think, thank you for the question, Steve. And what might make it a little confusing is that Michael and I are not here as opponents. We agree on more than we disagree. And I'd like to think that we're operating in some kind of science mode where we're trying to work out, collaborate to working out, in this case, what are good and bad forms of individualism. And that I would like to be able to have a conversation with anyone. Back to Atlas Shrugged, that's a stinging critique of Ayn Rand's objectivism. But I'd actually like to have a conversation with fans of Ayn Rand, because I think there can be a right and wrong to these matters. As to and I mean, even Ayn Rand distinguished between good and bad forms of individualism. I don't think that there's a form of individualism out there that doesn't distinguish between good and bad forms, because nobody's counseling rape and murder and mayhem. Rand distinguished between typically smart and stupid forms of selfishness. And so, but if we fine tune that, we might be able to come up to some agreement as to why these things are working or not. And I think especially in the case of individualism, which for me is interesting, and again, I don't expect Michael to disagree, is that if what's needed is to have something that's richly multi-level in terms of functional organization, including at the global scale and all these different units in between. And of course, individuals in some sense are making decisions and so on and so forth. So yeah, we're not forgetting individuals, but why would you call something that multi-level individualism? Why? So and then again, I'd hope that Michael and I and everyone in this call might agree on that. Back to you, Steve.
Could I just add one comment? Everything you said about individuals also pertains, though, to collectives and groups. You mentioned a variety of sort of bad things that individuals can do, but all of those things apply equally to all the other levels as well.
Yes. I mean, that's the whole point. The concept of organism, its presence and absence, because there is such a thing as just a lack of functional organization, chaos, that exists too. But whenever a unit becomes functionally organized, it becomes a kind of an organism. That's why we have words such as corporation, body politic, and so on and so forth. And then the same nexus of problems exist at that level. So I couldn't agree with you more, Steve. So see, we only have 8 more minutes, and so let me see what. Let's see. I'm trying to Vedant. do you want to speak your question?
I don't have any specific question as such. Yeah, but I would like to ask one thing about the individual diversity. So now I'm from India, so I'm considering that there is too much diversity, linguistic and maybe class, caste, and a number of things. So if you have to incorporate or unite this diversity, then individualism, I don't think so that individualism would work. You need some higher identity like nation or the religion or whatever, or the state. So when you are talking about individualism, how would you suggest to unite the diversity?
Right. Michael, do you want to?
Well, yeah. I just thought of another example. Like when nonprofits want to raise money from individuals, they have to do certain things to trigger in the individual's brain the desire to give. And we know that there's this kind of delusion of caring if you show too many people that are starving, say, for example, as opposed to, showing one little person. I call this the Indugu effect from that film with Jack Nicholson called About Schmidt, where he late night is channel surfing and he comes across one of these nonprofits that asks you to adopt a child in Africa. And he ends up adopting this child, just online, whose name is Indugu. And he, and I did this too. I adopted a child and for a couple of years and sent money every month. And they kind of tricked my brain into caring about her. Like, here's a picture of her. Here's her family. Here's where she lives. She likes soccer and she does this. This is where she goes to school. And, I felt like, well, she's an honorary friend of mine now, and I want to help her. But if you showed me a picture of, 10,000 kids that have no school and they're starving, my mind just goes numb. What? I'm just one little guy. What can I do? Right. So that's a kind of a way of tricking individuals into caring about a larger group, by touching that part of their amygdala or limbic system or whatever, wherever it's happening in my brain. Anyway, I just thought of that example.
Yeah, well, I think that the point that you're making, Vedant, which I would agree with, is because we do need all these different layers of functional organization, each one of those must have an identity. And people are geniuses at this. This has always been the case, right back to our hunter-gatherer days, is that we operate in many different types of groups, all different contexts, a hunting group, a gathering group, this and that. Today, our churches, our sports clubs, so on and so forth. We are multi-group creatures, and every group has its own expectations, norms, and expectations. And danged if we can't recognize the context and do what's needed to do in each one of those groups. Isn't that amazing? And there's a wonderful example of that by the anthropologist Steve Lansing, who was studying the water temple system of Bali. It's an elaborate religion that orchestrates rice agriculture in Bali. I think, Michael, you know it. And there's an irrigation system, which of course includes many nodes ending up with the water coming out into the field. So think of it as like this multiple node irrigation system. There's a temple at every node and a deity in every temple. And then that orchestrates the activities of the downstream congregation. So first think of it as just a technical problem, an agricultural problem of how we're going to maintain this big irrigation system. And then we superimpose upon that a religious system, which has multiple identities that orchestrates the appropriate behaviors. I mean, that's just one example. And so I think that that speaks to the need of these social identities. But of course, it's not always the case that those social identities function for the common good. It is in that case. But in many, many, many cases, there's social identities which are deeply divisive and unequal and exploitative. And that's minority groups of all sorts. And so those are social identities that we don't want. But Michael, do you have something to say about that? And then we'll have one last question.
Oh yeah, here I just thought of an example of there is this popular cable television show called Deadliest Catch, or maybe it's World's Deadliest Catch. It's about the crab fishermen up in Alaska in the the Bering Sea there, and it's a super dangerous job. It's like 10 times more dangerous than walking patrol in Afghanistan during the war there, and the reason for this, the reason it's so dangerous is because the moment the season opens, all these guys on their boats, they rush out to get as much crab as they possibly can, even though the state put a limit on how much you can catch. They didn't define the property and the total collective limit that we're going to set, and so they reconfigured that you, David, are going to get 1,000 pounds or 1,000 tons, or I don't know what the number is, of crabs in the season, but the whole group is going to be limited so that you'll get your 1,000 pounds of crab, whether you do it tomorrow or it takes a month or you wait till the sun comes out and the seas are calmer or whatever. And I'm told, I was reading this book called Mine that describes all this, that now the show has a harder time making it kind of sexy, like, ooh, it's super dangerous, because it's not very dangerous anymore, because it's all safety and controlled and regulated, and they still get the same amount of crab, but no one's dying anymore.
Well, that brings up Eleanor Ostrom's work and basically common pool resource arrangements, good and bad. And she has many examples of how groups that are doing in just that situation have very clever arrangements that actually allow that kind of disruptive, to prevent that kind of disruptive competition. And you're right, it's not dramatic, so you wouldn't watch it on TV. But the fact is, it's really cool the way it works. It's the way we want it. We want to be bored in that way, is the way I would think of it.
Yeah.
Gosh, it's the time is up, and I actually have a hard stop. Usually, I would go on and actually, frankly, Michael, do you have a few more minutes, or maybe we ought to just quit? We'll keep within the hour. But I want to thank everyone for this great time together. Michael, you especially, and for everybody else. This will be recorded.
You're welcome.
And the conversation,
Nice to
of
see you
course, will continue.
It will continue. Yes, we'll do it again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.